So, as there is usually the problem of those whom do we punish, those who are late or who are on time, we punish those who possibly come later. Stephen Brawer has sent around an abstract with the title. He will tell us something that is in a way especially relevant today, looking at the international developments. So, Stephen, you have the word.
Okay, I will try and make this according to my question to Peter, the moderator. I asked approximately how long I should make these remarks. He said basically we try and limit it to 15 minutes, which is fine. And then I guess the rest of the time there is discussion, question and answers. If it's normally 1 hour, or is it possible that it goes longer?
Well, we usually have about 1 hour, but it depends on how the discussion develops.
Okay. All right. Well, the general perspective that I wrote, I don't know if everyone had access to that. I hope they did. The title of it that I wrote was "The Issue of Human Rights in a Multipolar World. How will the new Trump administration affect the international debate on human rights?" And obviously, I don't think it's a secret that there is a great transformation underway based on the inauguration and election, of course, of President Donald Trump. This has, in my view, shaken up the foundations of international relations in many ways, maybe some good, maybe not so good. It's a mixed bag, but the point is that the old geometry that had been dominating, I would say, generally, at least since the dissolving of the former Soviet Union, if we include coming from Clinton forward, regardless of who was the actual acting American president, there was a very consistent power structure that was maintained partly through NATO, but also because of a continuing what has often been called, or should be properly called, the so-called Anglo-American special relationship, which came effectively into power immediately following the Second World War, with the emergence of what I will just briefly quote Winston Churchill's remarks that he made this speech in Fulton, Missouri, where he outlined the idea of a division of the world between the so-called West and Soviet bloc. And he also was very clearly remarking that with British brains and American muscle, they will continue to rule the world. Now, what does that mean? It meant that for Churchill, the role of the United States would be a subsidiary to British imperial policy, which was a global policy and has been for a number of centuries. China has definitely suffered from it in the Opium Wars. I mean, we can go through details. I don't think that's necessary. But in point of fact, this was a continuation of the British imperial policy in a modern form. and that is called the special relationship. Now, I just mentioned this because, unfortunately, those people who probably know, yesterday, Starmer went to the United States to meet Trump after several other Europeans because of Trump's intervention to end the Ukrainian war, and the agreements and discussion that have finally entered into the world picture between the American administration and the Russian government. This has sent European EU power policies and representatives through the roof. They in fact are saying openly that they don't want the war to stop, but would rather, in their own terms, continue the war on completely unrealistic terms, and also on terms that deny the reality that the war is effectively being lost to Europe. Nonetheless, there is a very broad discussion of these terms. I mentioned, if one hasn't seen it, I hope that people will. There was a rather historic speech by Jeffrey Sachs, the American professor, in the European Parliament recently. If you haven't seen it, it was only about 2 or 3 days, I think maybe 3 days ago. It should be seen because it's, in my view, quite historic in what he outlines from his position as to how the international power structure has been played out, especially from a very personal basis that he has been involved in since the dissolution of the former Soviet Union in the beginning of the 1990s. He points out, as does another speaker, who I know people are familiar with, Kishore Mahbubani, who has written an article on whether Europe will take the opportunity to rethink its position in international policy for its own relative interests, since the old structure of a complete control by the US together with NATO is no longer on the table as it stands right now. So what's going to happen? Well, I will mention two things which I think set the tone for this question, at least partially on the issue of human rights. There was a conference which the UN Human Rights Council, high-level session in Geneva on the 24th of February. Perhaps everyone is already quite aware of that, since this is openly focused on the issue of human rights. But one, I think, very crucial point to understand the challenge of what we are up against in terms of this great transformation process that is underway in the world, historic period, are the two remarks by the foreign ministers, both from China and from India. The main point that they outlined together, although China and India obviously have their own sovereign and strategic interests, is ending poverty is the leading human right. That China and India are both reflecting this in their remarks, both foreign ministers, to the UN Human Rights Council at this high-level session that occurred in Geneva. And the foreign minister Wang Yi of China said, the goal of human rights is to uphold fairness and justice, the rights to subsistence and development should be taken as the fundamental human rights of primary importance. and that you have to begin with what he called a people-centered approach, which is what is required in order to address this. Now, I say, as the chairman, in part of my role as chairman of the Belt and Road Institute in Sweden, that people-centered, people-to-people communication is actually a part of the Belt and Road Initiative. It is not only about infrastructure, but it is also about business people-to-people communication. So I think that is a part very clearly of the perspective of China, of the official position of the Chinese government of Wang Yi. But in addition, the Indian External Affairs Minister, Jaishankar, emphasized that India's, quote, unwavering commitment to human rights is deeply rooted in its enduring philosophy of global unity and openness and mutual respect. And then he mentioned Indian philosophy. I'm not so familiar with the term, but it was Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, which is essentially, I imagine, a Hindu term for the world as one family, as I've been made to see. Now, that reflects itself in clearly in the remarks of Xi Jinping's idea of a community for a shared future for mankind. So here you have the two largest nations on the planet population-wise, and clearly moving rapidly in the direction of global development, outlining both their perspectives on human rights, which, although they're not exactly the same, they have very clear points of commonality. And this also represents a certain reality that I think is not being properly embraced in the so-called European perspective or the so-called Western perspective, which is that inevitably, yes, there is a economic rise of Asia in the world, which is inevitable, and it is ongoing, and it is not going to stop. Okay, how does the West respond to this? How do you get this idea more, let's say, the challenge that I see coming up in the coming year and even forward is, how do you get an understanding that would incorporate both the vision that is outlined more directly by India and China, together with the European Union and eventually the United States, and obviously in partly including Russia as well, among all other countries. This has difficult elements because I think Western policy and conceptions of human rights are not the same as the thought processes which define human rights from a more Asiatic perspective. Their idea is often based on an idea of individual freedom, which is unregulated and has an unregulated aspect to it, at least in its liberal form, which is the generally dominant thought process of Western notions of freedom and so-called human rights. And they do not ally in fundamental perspective with what, for example, I took up just now with the UN Human Rights Council from the position of China and India. So how can this be resolved? Well, my idea, which I'm working on in terms of my research, has many aspects to it, but I will make a couple of suggestions which I think are worthwhile. I can recommend perhaps a book that people have already heard, which I think does have a certain role to play in this. It's called The New China Playbook. It's written by Kenyu Jin, who is the daughter. She teaches at the London School of Economics, but her father has been one of the leaders in China finance department, and her perspective is, without going into great detail, beyond socialism and capitalism, and why the West has failed to understand what is happening in China and how the new generation is emerging in terms of economic transformations which have occurred since Deng Xiaoping's opening up at the end of the 1970s. She's only, I think, 41 or 42, so she is born into the generation and talks about the change in the thinking among the Chinese population that has occurred among those who have been born after the emergence of, or the opening up of, China. It's a contribution to this type of discussion, which I think is avoiding and breaking the ideological realities that divide and prevent a genuine understanding of how one can bridge the thinking of East and West, not only on economic policies, but on general, deeper thought processes which are reflected in the issue of human rights. I don't think that it is possible to abstractly divide the issue of economic issues and economic development from so-called social or philosophical issues of what defines human rights as an innate quality for human beings in general. Although one can obviously discuss details of housing, of medical care, and so forth and so on. All of these things are clearly of relevance, but they're not, you cannot make artificial abstract divisions that do not incorporate both the necessity for addressing the fundamental primary goal, as I think justly Wang Yi says, that fairness and justice involves economic justice as well. So what I can say about I don't want to speak altogether too long, but what I do want to say is I have and am doing personal research on the importance of a Western thinker, Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, who lived from 1646 to 1716. Not alone was he a Western so-called born European thinker, but he was perhaps the only European thinker, in my view, certainly of relevance, that has understood the importance of Chinese civilization, not alone during his time, but during the time in which he actually reflected certain ideas which are most relevant for precisely this question of how to bridge and resolve a more fundamental understanding of human rights in the world today. There have been a number of books. I just mentioned this one. It's called Leibniz in China. A Commerce of Light. It was written by Franklin Perkins in the beginning of the 2000, I think about 2004 or 6. But it's available. It does identify this point that Leibniz had, together with others who he was corresponding with, Jesuit missionaries, a very deep interest in the both relevance and ability to grasp the interaction between Europe and China at that time. But the relevance of raising this question in its full capacity today has explicitly relevant means of overcoming the general problem of dogmatism and ideological divisions, which prevent an understanding between cultures from actually functioning as one would hope, to bring together humanity, as one could say, as one family. In my view, we cannot continue to maintain a division between what has often historically been called left and right. And Leibniz, more than any other, developed even before the so-called emergence of socialism, Marxism, capitalism in the late 17 and early 1800s, an idea of what he called physical economy. And this notion of physical economy was built on the idea of the common good. And that is the fundamental premise that I think resonates with the kind of thinking that you get from Wang Yi in China and even from Shankar in India. And hopefully this can become a concept that can play a significant role in identifying how this issue of human rights can be addressed. There's a lot I could say about Mr. Trump and about this meeting between Sharm, sorry, what's his name? The Prime Minister from England, Sharma, that he went to the U.S. explicitly in this press conference to reestablish this so-called special relationship. And in my view, the fact that it appears in the press conference that I listened to that this is still being embraced in one form or another by Trump, despite his new directions in terms of the issue of peace in Ukraine and NATO. I think this is not a good sign. I think it's a very dangerous development personally, not only for the potential for maintaining stability and world peace, but even for his political future, if he maintains his so-called partial embracement of this so-called special relationship. So let me leave it at that and open the discussion. There are many points that I can elaborate if there is comments or criticisms or questions. So thank you for the time to speak.
Okay, Stephen, thanks very much. We may leave Mr. Trump to the psychologists or psychotherapists. I'm misusing my role as moderating this session. One question. you mentioned yourself implicitly. In a way, you said China is looking for a universal concept, and at the same time, you mentioned many points that are actually, let's say, contradicting this approach of having a universal concept. And this is a way, or this is a topic we are permanently struggling with it. That on the one hand, of course, there is this idea of universality, and at the same time, there is the permanent threat or the permanent question of having very different concepts, having very different foundations from where we start. You mentioned Churchill in the beginning, and Churchill said as well, I think it was 1947, that democracy is the worst form of all political systems, but at the same time, we don't have any thing that is better. I don't know exactly the wording, but this is the question for me then, how to link, this dimension of a political dimension, meaning in terms of politics, not polities and politics, linking it to the economic development and linking it to, if you want, the philosophical background. Having said, leaving Mr. Trump to the section of psychology or psychiatry, Mr. Musk, Elon Musk is another person, and this is something I came across where I'm a little bit surprised that he is now considered in China to be actually a bridge between the United States and China. He had been visiting China last year in April, so one year ago, before he actively engaged in politics. But he is seen now as well as one of the key factors to bridge between the two countries or between the two, if you want, political concepts. One point in this connection that makes me thinking what is actually the going on here, that we find increasingly, and you mentioned multipolarity in the beginning, that we find increasingly amongst leading conservative forces in the West some self-criticism. I just read yesterday or today an article in The Economist saying that the inequality problem is one of the major problems that we, meaning in this case the West, faces. They wouldn't have done this a year or 2 years before. Now they are getting more and more aware of this. There are initiatives of taxing the rich by the rich. And there is, of course, on the other hand, this move to the far right. How to deal with this in the international context of thinking about universal context in terms of, or against the background of, on the one hand, seeing these developments, on the other hand, seeing a severe difference in economic concepts. Energy. Energy is, from the side of China, seen as non-competitive area, meaning an area where we have to engage, we from China, Chinese industries, to solve the climate problem. In the West, and now I take the United States of America and Europe together, it is seen as a competitive factor. It's not about the environment, but it is about being one of the superior forces in the energy sector. The same applies for digitization and artificial intelligence. We have the DeepSeek now that came as a shock for Europe, for West, for United States, but it had not been considered to be a common project. Now we made progress. we as a world, people in the world being interested in this area. So how to deal with these tensions? Basically the question, if you look into details, you come across these tensions. And that would be my question. You did not mention actually the BRICS, the Silk Road, or I had been just passing by. But I think these are important points as well, where actually, well, you mentioned it is about communication as well, but to strengthen this factor of the old Ricardian approach of comparative advantage, and now we come to a new concept of cooperative advantage. And that's something where it may be possible you can elaborate a little bit on this. Before you answer, perhaps somebody else wants to immediately step in and we can connect something. Apparently not so, just go ahead.
Well, I can make some brief, I try and keep it brief so we can hopefully have a lot of discussion. I think it's important right now with the nature of the world situation to engage in a productive dialogue, ongoing as much as possible. When it comes to Winston Churchill, I just say briefly, Churchill said a lot of things, but he was nothing else but a part of the broader British Empire, which and a representative and spokesman for it. He had no other fundamental purpose. And if you want to read a clear accounting of that, I suggest there was a book written by the son of Franklin Roosevelt, Elliot Roosevelt, at the end, after, unfortunately, Franklin Roosevelt died. Franklin Roosevelt and Churchill did not have similar views about how the world would look after the defeat of the Nazis. That is a myth, and it was promoted in this press conference falsely by the perspective that was put forward by Starmer that the US and Britain defeated the Nazis. Well, it was not just the US and Britain, number one. It was essential involvement, whatever you might think or not think about Stalin, but the sacrifice by the people of Russia or the Soviet Union at the time was essential to the defeat of the Nazi war machine, which is known, it's a fact. The other thing is, Britain and the United States have not been friends for the extended period that it is being promoted and was promoted in this dialogue. So when you talk about Churchill, his view and Roosevelt's view are documented to have been completely different ideas about how the world would look in the post-World War II period. Unfortunately, with the death of Roosevelt and the rise of Harry Truman, who was a puppet for this British policy of, with American muscle and British brains, that they will continue to run the world. But Churchill, as well as I've said of the American administrations, that people tend to think, well, Trump is no, well, I say this in the reference to Clinton, Obama, Bush. People tend to look at these personalities as having some difference in direction. There was no difference fundamentally after the dissolving of the Soviet Union in direction that the US would be dominating world power through its role together with NATO. That was the policy of Wolfowitz, the policy of Cheney, the policy of the neocons. That policy did not change with Obama. It did not change from the beginning with Clinton. And the policy now, if Trump is going to survive, is going to have to be a break with this so-called special relationship, which is built on imperial policy. It is not built on sovereignty, nor is it built on an idea of genuine human economic development. Although there are aspects to the discussion that you raise, for example, with Elon Musk, where this is an example of market economy, which Elon Musk clearly represents and has been a certain friend in China, because there is an interest between China and economic forces in the West and in the US to cooperate on economics, on business relationships. And in one sense, it's clearly why, because Xi Jinping has also said, we're in one boat. So how are we going to get along? Well, partly through business interaction. But the perspective where you see that Elon Musk and Trump are avid supporters of Milei in Argentina, and you mentioned BRICS. What did Milei do when he came to power? He took Argentina out of the BRICS. Because the BRICS, although it is a expanding process that is leading in it with the support of China, but hopefully with other countries, India, Brazil, in the direction that there are sovereign interests of the majority of countries that are not explicitly under a dollar-based supranational American power structure or British American power structure. So yes, that is an important step. Obviously, we know that Trump has explicitly, as of now, denounced it. I don't think he's going to necessarily get very far with that. That's my personal view. I think it will continue, but the underlying point, which I think is what I hope can be discussed, it might be not altogether possible in this particular time, but number one, the reference to Leibniz includes more than just a question of basic economics in terms of physical production, economy, for guaranteeing the well-being of human beings. It also has a dimension of spirituality, which is very much, in my view, a part of Chinese civilization. It's not only Confucian, it also goes back to the Yi Jing, and many points on that I'm studying in detail. The point is, there is a combination. Human beings are not simply economic related in the sense that we are not complete. Our happiness does not totally depend only on the basic needs of survival, eating, having a home, although these are crucial and I think are reflected in this human rights concepts. There is a quality that is defined by the nature of human beings, which is a Leibnizian idea of happiness. And it is not based on pleasure as seeking mere entertainment or sexual gratification or that type of notion of satisfaction. on the basis of sensual gratification. But human beings are more complex than just the idea of simply surviving on the basic terms of survival. We have a quality which is unique in my view. And that quality has to be included in order to resolve this notion of how do you combine the common good with the notion of what defines the nature of human beings in light of this in the universe in terms of happiness and happiness in the sense that we have a purpose, that we're not just randomly living on the planet. We have a purpose, and that purpose can be met by how we interact. Much of that is not an acting principle in and criteria and how Western thinking is dominating. It is certainly not the fundamental thinking, or never has been in the British Empire, going back to the time when Leibniz died and King George I came to power, which was the Hanoverian Hanoverian secession. They have many philosophies. Locke, I won't go through them all, but they are not based on the idea, neither of what I would call a spiritual notion of man in a divine image, which is a Renaissance concept that Leibniz had, but he got it from Plato, from Cusa. And that idea of how the nature of human beings is crucial in understanding how the possibility for bridging a deeper understanding that will hold, that will work. So I say that because there are complications, as Peter has said. There are ideological complications that have divided the notion of capitalism and socialism. I don't think they are fundamental. I think if one understands the nature of physical economy, human well-being, in light of what defines the nature of human beings, they can be both resolved in a positive way. But it's not an easy, this is not an easy project or perspective. It's challenging. But in my view, it's the direction we need to go, to leave behind the divisions, the old geopolitical divisions, which, as I've said in many of the remarks I make when I'm interviewed, that geopolitics should go in the grave of mankind, in the dustbin. It doesn't help. It is a division of the world. Ask yourself, why was Russia not included in NATO? They wanted to be a part of NATO when they were not even strong at the time that the Soviet Union dissolved. And the agreement was officially made in a speech by even Hans-Dietrich Genscher that NATO will not go east. And they lied and did it anyway. So there is never, and this is geopolitics, they do not and did not, even today, wish to include Russia in a common security pact that will benefit all, even Europe. No, Russia is a threat. Putin is a terrible dictator. We have to have a new security doctrine, even if it is not NATO, which will stop the horrible Russians, Russia-phobia. That has to go. That's part of geopolitics. That's the old game. Yeah, sure. Thank you, Mehmet. We don't hear you though.
Yes. Thank you very much, Stephen, for your detailed, I think, nevertheless very detailed presentation. It was also historical and chronological, which is fine and good because a lot of things the people forget, especially if we are looking to the process, as you said, of the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the NATO case, everything is brought out of the minds of the people. But as far as I've understood, your approach is more an approach in general, as far as I've understood you. It's more a sort of philosophical approach, what you make. So the material processes, you said also capitalism, socialism, when I understand you correctly, are of less importance, when I understand you correctly. But isn't it the case that nowadays, when we have still a lot of material injustice, inequalities, all the things we know, isn't it the case that we, more than ever, only a question to you, should focus on these things, not so much on these ways of thinking, which you emphasize, I think, more than ever, on material processes, on organization, on things like capitalism, socialism. Only a question to you, Stephen. If I have understood you right, also your emphasis on Leibniz, which is also, can we say, mental, philosophical approach. It reminds me a little bit of Goethe's East-West-Divan, östlich-westlicher Divan, where Goethe tries to combine a little bit East-West and all these things. But is this your approach? This is what I'm asking.
No, not exactly. I
know, but
I think you partly missed or misunderstood. Maybe I didn't make it clear enough when I addressed the problem of socialism, and you have a socialist society in China, you have a so-called capitalist society in the U.S., in other parts of what is called market economy. Obviously, these are relevant factors, very relevant factors. The question that I meant to identify is there is and has been a deliberate part of geopolitics to utilize this so-called ideological distinction and theoretical distinction, which is complicated to discuss right here in terms of the fundamental aspects of Marxism or socialism versus capitalism. Most all capitalist philosophy is built around Adam Smith, Ricardo, Malthus, and all British philosophers. That is what you learn when you go to economic schools in any university in the West. You do not learn about neither the influence of physical economy, which was the foundation of Leibniz, nor what then emerges at the beginning of the founding of the United States, which was called the American system of political economy. Marx knew that there was such a thing. He ignored it. He basically addressed capitalism based on the British model of Smith, Ricardo, Malthus, and others, which was essentially a false division. And that's a topic that needs more elaboration. I do understand that. But my point is not that these questions that you are touching on are in any way less relevant than the more what I consider to be crucial, more historical, philosophical, and I would say even in a certain sense theological questions, or not in a specific notion that one is a Muslim or a Jew or a Christian, but in the sense of what defines human beings differently than all the other so-called animals or beasts of the planet. we have a unique role in human and global history that is based on a certain power of creative thinking. When we talk about innovation, which is crucial now in China, it's also crucial around the issue of artificial intelligence, but that's a tool. That's a tool that is developed by the powers of the human mind, which is unique. And that's what I mean when I say that there is an inseparable, in my view, a need to unite economic justice with a worldview that defines human beings and civilizations with a common foundation that can hopefully lead into what is been referred to as one family or a community for a shared future for mankind. We are one human society, but we are not under the present political and economic dominant general thought processes allowed to propagate that fully on a global basis. But it is obviously moving in the, I would say, in relation in certain respects to the BRICS alignment, even on a somewhat security basis, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. These are part of a development rejecting the unipolar world, but the unipolar world, which people talk about, has been the modern form of what is called the, I've mentioned, the special relationship or the modern form of the British Empire. And that is rotten. That is not based on the common interests of humanity. It has to go, and there's going to be a fight to do it. Because when you hear what happened in this press conference, the British, with all of their sophistication, are not ready to give up their arrogance or their idea that they are better than everyone else, in one sense.
Yeah.
Hey, Stephen. Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. So, and actually, I have some one follow-up question in terms of your philosophical approach. From the past several weeks after the Trump administration came to power, we could see that there is a very evident tendency that the Trump administration is now prioritizing domestic interest over international cooperation. Right? And so when you are mentioning the United Nations Human Rights Council, the Chinese and the Indian Foreign Affairs, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, both of them, they are sharing, the notion, the philosophical notion. So you mentioned like the Indian, the minister, he mentioned that all humankind is a family, and so China, we also have the same saying as like which is also the philosophical base. In Chinese is 天下大同, which means the sharing universal peace. But now, Xi Jinping has developed it into the community for shared future for all the humankind. So they have very similar philosophy. But when we are, so we are, kind of like shocked by the news that what the Trump administration has taken actions such as, they have withdrawn from the international organizations and communities such as, not long ago, the WHO, and also the Paris Climate Agreement, and also like the imposing the imposing sanctions on the International Criminal Court. So from all these actions, so it seems that the U.S. Is kind of like rather than to share some common ground, around the world, but they are actually trying to widen the gap, not only between the West and the East, but also, the philosophical basis for human rights protection is also, the discrepancy between the philosophical discrepancy between even within the West. Even within West is trying to, widening. This is my observation. So I would like to hear, your comments toward this, the recent, the actions that the administration, the American administration has taken.
Yeah, well, I understand that the actions that Trump has taken officially on tariffs to impose on China, that he has withdrawn. This is a sensitive question on whether or not, according to a lot of people, of course, and I think the Chinese are very much on to this, is the Paris Agreement is based on a certain idea that climate change is been driven by human activity, and that this has to be addressed through measures that will reduce the amount of carbon dioxide. Now, that's not automatically a view that is accepted on all fronts. You might have an international agreement on that because of IPCC and others that promote it. It is an issue of debate that has not really been tolerated in the past. Now, China has been leading and playing a very important role in development of solar power and environmentally sound development, electric vehicles. This is all very good. And it should not be, in my view, inhibited the international exchange and trade. However, I also have mentioned a certain part of U.S. history, which was I refer to as the American system, that was built on an initial idea that British free trade at that time, what they called free trade, was to dump cheap goods in the United States to prevent the United States as a newly founded republic to have the possibility of developing their own nascent manufacturing. So the tariffs were put on in order to defend the right of, at that time, a newly founded republic to build up its own internal manufacturing. Now, Trump has made reference even at times to people like William McKinley, who was an advocate of American system in his time. That's quite a bit later. It's at the turn of the 1900s. But Trump is using this argument of tariff in the way that you hear that which he is correct about, that the United States industrial capacity has diminished and virtually rotted. There is no has been no investment of any significant type in infrastructure. This is in trains. There are no fast trains. China has 40,000 kilometers of fast trains and is developing magnetically levitated trains. China is way ahead. And that's good. China is going forward. But for Trump, he wants to bring the US back to a so-called leading position and is arguing that the way that he's going to do this is by using tariffs as a tool to balance the trade. That's his argument. Now, I'm not saying that's completely good, but I'm saying that that's where the thinking is coming from. How do we bring the US back to a more advanced industrial capability? My point is, a Swede, but also as an American, is that's good. The US should become an industrial power. Together with China, to promote and eliminate poverty, not to claw at each other or compete. Of course, the general view that is also very, it was not only the Trump administration. Now, this was very much in the Biden administration, and it was across Democratic and Republican lines that China is a threat. We still have that in Sweden. The EU is saying it over and over again. We have to deal with China, but they're a threat. And the Munich Security Conference, they said China wants to dominate the world. That's not true. But it's perceived because of the way that China is becoming the perhaps most number one economic power. U.S. power is basically, as Starmer said, it's based on London and Wall Street. It's Wall Street and London and BlackRock that are speculators on money. They don't invest from the standpoint of long-term development. They don't care about that. They care about short-term excessive profits, and their markets and their investors also care about money, making money. So we have that problem. It doesn't solve the problems that you're raising in terms of how can the US and China cooperate completely. I don't think it will be completely on the Paris Agreement, personally, although I think China will continue to play, from what I understand, a major role in promoting solar and so-called non-carbon energy capabilities, but not exclusively. China is also promoting nuclear power. Internally, they would never give it up. They're not giving up coal. They're talking about 2060 as being a neutral period. But they are not going to give up coal production. They have clean coal, but they also use nuclear, and I think very importantly, going for a fourth generation form of nuclear power called fusion, which would provide virtually unlimited energy for mankind. So these things should be continued. China is doing those things. They're doing the right thing. But the challenge is a combination of ideological issues that are related to this British policy and what the West sees or has seen as environmental policy, or the so-called green agenda, and the EU has been heavy in this, is also tied to a British philosopher called Malthus, who said that there will never be enough resources to provide for all the people. Therefore, he even said that it was good that poor people died of disease, because if there were too many people, there wouldn't be enough resources to provide. Now, that doctrine is false. But it has been and it's not a Chinese view of environmentalism whatsoever, but it has influenced the green ideology, which is neo-Malthusian, that says there isn't enough for everybody. So we have to garner our share to maintain our interests. Henry Kissinger had this view in a very famous National Security Memorandum 200, which you can Google and look at. National Security Memorandum 200. He said the threat from Brazil and southern countries where they were going to have too many people and they would use the resources that we in the industrial nations need. That's in the 1960s and 70s we're talking about. So that's the problem. Malthusianism is rotten, and it is infected the thinking of the green environmentalist movement in the West. It has to stop. Clean water, clean air, which is China's perspective, is great, and everybody should work for that. But not with the idea that we have too few resources to provide for the general well-being of mankind. That's a lie. And that has been used to justify a kind of individual philosophy which says, go for it yourself. Get rich like Elon Musk, Bill Gates, become an entrepreneur, become so rich that you can do whatever you want, blah, blah, blah. And what happens to the common good? Well, that's not so high priority. And we see that as a major problem. I've seen it in the US since I grew up, where poverty was not considered to be an issue that was going to be eliminated, not simply talked about, but eliminated. We have ghettos. We still have horrible ghettos with drugs. This is a factor coming from a notion of not only what China has referred to as the law of the jungle in terms of international policy, which is wrong, but the idea of the strong survive and the weak, well, that's too bad for them. That's not what humanity needs. So my answer to you is it's a mixed bag. Nothing is black and white right now. There are a lot of shades of gray. Some things can be good. I think Trump is doing certain things, whether his motivation is completely moral, I won't argue, but he wants to stop the war in Ukraine. We're very close. Humanity has been very close to a third world war, a general thermonuclear war. And the Europeans, too many of them still haven't understood that or don't wish to understand it. Trump understands, number one, that this has been a losing battle, an expensive losing battle, and it should end. Then there are other issues which are not generally talked about, like what I mentioned, why NATO moved east when right up to the Russian border, when the Russians said long ago, don't do that. And NATO said, we don't care what you say. And now you have gotten a tragedy where over maybe 1 million people have died because of a refusal to negotiate and to understand the Russian concern for moving not only into Poland, Romania, but then all the way up to the border in Ukraine. When they weren't even invited into NATO. Why not? Because geopolitics said we have to have an enemy image. And right now the enemy image is Russia, and I'm telling you, China. So if that's not turned around, then there will be increasing risks for confrontation. Maybe over Taiwan, maybe over the AUKUS, the Japan, Philippines, Australia, India, US. That's also geopolitics. They don't include China as being a part of the Security Pact. Why not? Because China is an enemy. That's where these games are played. They call it the Great Game. Zbigniew Brzezinski wrote a book called The Grand Chessboard, where he outlined all of this after the expansion of NATO. We are going to run the world, its power, and power will be imposed where those countries who don't go along with it will be either overthrown or invaded, like regime change. These things are not being told to the public. And that's a tragedy and a very difficult problem. But these are some of the things we're going to have to do. If we want to win the fight for human rights, you can't ignore these factors. They're crucial to understanding the problem and what to do about it. I mean, I don't have a hotline to Donald Trump, and even if I did, I'm not sure that his gang would necessarily understand the things that I would have to tell them. But I'm working on it. I'm also, as you well know, working in China. I think I will continue to make interviews and to the degree that we can expand our interaction with the human rights group, I think these kinds of questions are very, very important parts of the research and discussion that we can generate in order to make the question of human rights work as a principle that can unite people and countries.
Well, I think, Johan?
I just want to express, thanks for your very detailed comments. And maybe later we can discuss further. So, because of the time limit today. Okay, Peter.
Yeah. Well, I think there are many issues. Actually, I would like to continue to discuss. One being another British or English, I don't know actually, was he Scottish as well, philosopher David Hume, the is and ought question. And then we come to the tension there actually. When I worked in Havana, it came always up, this question, there is something, and I mentioned Havana or Cuba with Fidel Castro as well being Jesuit, or being reared up as Jesuit. So you have this kind of interesting dimension there. The still Pope, Francesco, Cuba, and the Jesuits. That is, and this is why I mentioned it now, in Cuba you could see the struggle between the ought to be, there is something we want, there is a concept, there is a vision, but at the same time this permanent struggle with the is, and that was the embargo, and we can compare many things now with the situation in China, the tariffs, tariff politics, and I think what I mentioned earlier, this move from comparative advantage to cooperative advantage. You mentioned some points there. I would emphasize them more to say that whatever is done and must be done in this perspective of cooperation. And then we have to look as well in the future how this develops. Starmer was in the Oval Office. Macron met Mr. Trump. And you mentioned in the beginning the multipolarity, but in a way we always talk up to now about bipolarity, the West against the East. Both Macron and Starmer interrupted literally Mr. Trump and said, stop this, this is not true. This is something remarkable, I think, in the perspective of what is going on. And then we have to look now, meaning this is then something to be discussed in 100 days, the famous 100 days, or in half a year, 1 year. What happens with Germany? What happens with Austria? What happens with Hungary? Where we have all a very strong nationalism, at the same time European orientation against, to some extent, against the United States, and at the same time a bridge between let's foster this bridge, the United States and, or Germany, Alice Weidel said this, our strong friends, our strong connections to the Trump administration. So to see how this develops in possibly a real multipolarity, and then to see what are the objective conditions that allow us possibly or will hinder us to get from this ought to be. We have this common concept of one humanity that has to move on to something that is an is, that we really can come to this point of cooperation. And I think this is something we have to discuss in the future more often, as well, the link between what we always have, the idea of universal human rights, but when it comes to the concrete cases, it is Mr. Musk, it is Mr. Trump, it is Alice Weidel, and who say, well, it's a great concept, but first it's me, and then we can discuss about anything further. So for today, I think we can close, must have to close here, and we'll see in about 4 weeks, meaning the last Friday in March. Gosh, it's nearly over this year. Last Friday in March, and yeah, thanks very much again, and see you then. Cheers.
Okay, thank you. One key point I wanted to just respond to briefly, Peter, is I fully support your idea of cooperation. I think many of us do, who are part of this. What is the criteria for that? That's not such a clear-cut and clear and easy issue to identify, because when you go from what our objective, our goal, or our ideal is, to the idea of why things are not working that way, then you have to identify the criteria of what is it that will bring cooperation.
Well, then we may come back to the Jesuits and say there we have some criteria we have in common with Fidel and with Francesco.
Okay. I'm not necessarily advocating the Jesuits on all fronts. That's a complicated question, but let us pursue things in the future, and I hope that this gave some food for thought, that we can go forward in the coming period to work together, because that's, my objective is how can we achieve cooperation, not how do we divide things.
And how do we develop the criteria for this cooperation?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, thanks very much, and we'll see you again soon. Cheers.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye bye.